Hello, everyone. My name is Darlene Lynch. I'm from the Center for Victims of Torture, and I am the Refugee Advocacy Lab State Coordinator for Georgia. It's a pleasure and an honor to be moderating this session on economic empowerment. I wear another hat. I am also the founder and chair of the Business and Immigration for Georgia Partnership, the big partnership we call it. And in Georgia, we have partnered with a very powerful business community to recognize the contributions of refugees and immigrants to our state. We talked earlier in this summit today about the moral imperatives and that the economic justifications were to supplement those moral imperatives. But I want to say that in Georgia, and I would imagine all states, they're all wrapped together. The sponsor of our legislation is a Republican and a minister who feels that meaningful work is important to each one of us as human beings, to use our skills, to reach our potential, support our families, and give back to the communities giving us so much and giving us a second chance. And so that's what this is all about. I'm excited to hear from our experts today. And we will do a quick round of introductions. I'll ask everybody to introduce themselves in a minute or two, and then we'll launch into some conversation. And I hope everybody has a pen and pencil or a laptop in front of them to take down these great ideas that our panelists have to offer. And I will start with Delegate Tran. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I am Kathy Tran. I serve in the Virginia House of Delegates and was first elected in 2017. I came to this country as a boat refugee from Vietnam when I was almost 2 years old, and now am a mom of 5. So you might see some of my children come in and out of the webinar. They like to join me, but I am very much looking forward to this conversation. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart.
Thank you. Representative Paul Ray from Utah.
Thank you. Representative Paul Ray from Utah. I was first elected in 2000, and I chair the Social Services Appropriations Committee, which does a lot of the funding for programs for refugees in our refugee center here locally, and have been really involved in looking at the programs that we have and trying to make some changes, and excited to be here today.
Thank you, Representative. And our last panelist, Representative Edgar Flores from Nevada.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. I've been a member of the Nevada State Legislature since 2014. And we are a part-time legislature. What that means is part of the year we are in session, and the other half of the year we have our regular day jobs. And I practice immigration law, and I'm honored to be here amongst such esteemed, hardworking folk.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I will note that we are a bipartisan panel here, which is something we're seeing at the state level, and we might all wish for a little bit more of at the federal level. We certainly see it in Georgia. I'm going to start with you, Representative Ray. You are in Utah, which is a Republican-led state. You are a Republican. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the motivation behind your initiative, SB 102, to remove the citizenship requirement for peace officers and dispatchers in Utah and allow legal permanent residents, including SIV holders, so folks who serve the U.S. military overseas, often in security positions, allow those folks to become police officers and serve their communities in Utah. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what motivated you.
You bet. Thank you. Well, it's kind of a two-lane highway here. The first part of it is we have people here that are not citizens that are more than qualified to work in law enforcement. And one of the things that we're trying to strive for is diversity. And we have a lot of law enforcement agencies right now that there's no hires available. Our Salt Lake City Police Department, they're down about 76 police officers, since the first of the year. many retiring, some just leaving altogether. And so we're struggling to fill positions, and we have a very talented pool that we could tap from, but we weren't allowed to. The state law, up until we changed it with Senate Bill 102, said that they had to be U.S. citizens. And so they could not apply or could not do anything, couldn't go through post without that status. And it just made a lot of sense because we do allow non-citizens to serve in the military. And it made no sense to say that you can't be a law enforcement officer. So we ran that bill this year, and it had a lot of bipartisan support. Maybe one vote against it in the entire process. So it came out very well with support from both sides of the aisle in both bodies, and we're excited to be able to move forward. And I know our chiefs of police are really excited because they have a much better pool now that they can go recruit from.
Thank you. And that's something that we're looking at Georgia. And I think one of the first steps is finding these obstacles, right? I don't think many people understand that citizenship is even a requirement for certain state police departments and other types of public work. And so I applaud that effort, and I'm glad to hear that it was so much supported. Delegate Tran, I know one of the things you're working on this session is creating a workforce study group. And these kinds of groups are the way to learn about the barriers and to uncover them and really modernize states so that they can maximize the talent in the refugee community. And I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about that study committee, what prompted you to create that, and the kind of support that you might have for that committee from the refugee community and the business community.
This year we passed through our budget process a directive asking our chief workforce advisor to assess the workforce barriers and opportunities that refugees who've been resettled in Virginia face. And I think this is so important. We've heard, qualitatively through stories and cases of individuals who are struggling with, like English language proficiency, with literacy in their own languages, all the way to people who have professional trainings and backgrounds, but who can't get their foot into the occupations that they are trained for, right? And so in our area, I live in Northern Virginia, it's the classic example of, a doctor from Iraq or Afghanistan who is now driving a cab or an Uber, right, car. And so how do we make sure that we're able to address the wide range of skills and backgrounds that refugees have? And this was a idea and request that came from Church World Services, and we worked with other refugee resettlement organizations in Virginia. And so the requirement for the study group is to bring together a wide range of stakeholders, both refugee resettlement organizations that are working formally in Virginia, as well as other nonprofit organizations that support refugees and coalitions that do that work, and also our public workforce system, employers, and refugees themselves. And so it's going to be a big group of folks that are going to be providing input, and I look forward to those recommendations that will, I think, be able to provide the gravitas that it'll take to go to the to our General Assembly and say, these are the steps, concrete policy steps or investments that we need to make in order to ensure that our refugees here in Virginia are able to be integrated into our workforce successfully.
And I wonder, Delegate Tran, if you could explain a little bit more about a little bit of the nuts and bolts. So will this be a series of meetings, and will they take place across the state? We have a similar initiative in Georgia called the Global Talent Study Committee, and it will travel around the state because we have great interest in the rural areas for refugee talent and global talent. And it'll take place over a series of meetings and then culminate in a report that will then use to advocate for reform. Is that sort of what you're doing, or are you taking a different approach?
So similarly, and I actually chatted with our Chief Workforce Advisor, Dr. Megan Healy, a couple of weeks ago as she was getting ready to kick off the study. So I think it's going to be a series of well, we are ending our COVID pandemic state of emergency on June 30th. So it was going to be some virtual sessions where the group was going to meet virtually. So I'm not sure how she's going to do it now that the state of emergency has ended. But in any case, it was going to be bringing the work group together to get some ideas. Then I'm actually have a note to myself, an action item where I'm going to connect her with some national organizations, such as World Education Services, Upwardly Global, the New American Economy, and others that are in this space and who might have data and examples of what other states are doing to approach similar issues. And so we're going to connect her with some national groups. And then, what she said was she was going to try to have a meeting with those groups to present to this work group, pull together some ideas that they will post publicly for comment, and then finalize their recommendations. So it may not be like a tour throughout the state, but there will definitely be opportunities for the public to weigh in and provide input as well. And at the end of the day, it's a policy framework for advocates to use to push for change and reform, and also for legislators such as myself to use, given the input from such diverse stakeholders, to be able to say this is a way forward for us and make the case for policy changes and also for funding.
Thank you. Assemblyman Flores, I have a question for you. I know that in Georgia, one of the things that our Workforce Study Committee is looking at is licensing. And we know that Representative Ray touched on one of the big issues with licensing for or eligibility requirements for police officers. You had a big bill in Nevada to remove immigration-related barriers to licensing. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about, I think it's AB 275, and what motivated you and how you took this particular approach of all licensing as opposed to looking at, for instance, just medical licensing or just whatever the case may be.
Well, thank you for that question. First, I want to make it clear that I want to give credit really to the whole Nevada Hispanic Legislative Caucus and a whole host of community partners and activists and just folk who are incredibly devoted to helping all Nevadans, not just some, that made this a reality. And so I wanted to put that out there. There's two questions in that. The first is, what is it that Nevada needs, right? And I think we have a shortage in teachers, we have a shortage in our medical facilities, we have a shortage with our police officers. There's a lot of different areas that we have a shortage in. And so the first thing I think collectively as a state folk will say is, well, we have a shortage there and we have a pool of talent here, why not connect the two? And in the past, we did that with our teachers where we had similar requirements where, say, for example, folk that have DACA or TPS weren't allowed to become teachers, but we have a teacher shortage. So logically, it only made sense that we said, wait a minute, let's remove some of those restrictions. And when there's an emergency like this, we allow folk to fill that void and when they have everything but that citizenship status right next to their name. The other thing is, a lot of states, and in the state of Nevada, you see this. To me, I've always thought it was just very odd that we have these agreements with other countries. So you'll see folk coming in from the Philippines, you'll see folk coming in from all these other countries. And I think that's amazing. We should give these folk an opportunity to come in and help fill these voids. But what I always thought was bizarre is, why are we leaving and looking for workforce in other countries when we have folk in our very own state, but for that citizenship being right next to their name, who can fill that void, who grew up in our communities, who are part of this community? So that's the first prong to the conversation. But the second prong to me is much more important. I think there's this sense of, well, we will use him when we need him. And I think we have a responsibility as electeds to say, well, when are we going to put the responsibility, the onus on us, to say, let's go out there and actively give them an opportunity to help themselves, not just when we have a void, not just when there's an emergency, not just when it's advantageous, for us to politically put out statements out there that work. And that's where this conversation landed. We said we can't just find the areas where we have a shortage of workers. We need to go to the actual community and stop utilizing these phrases. And we're so accustomed to it, and I use it all the time because I'm an immigration attorney. Immigrant, migrant, refugee, they're just Nevadans. They've been in here, they're incorporated, they're integrated into our society. Now, some of them may be navigating a very complex immigration world, as we all know. They're navigating that world, but they are no less Nevadan than every other individual that's in this state, no less than me or my neighbors. And that's where the conversation landed. And how do we make sure that we're allowing folk to get prepared so that when they become legal permanent residents, when they become U.S. citizens, that they can maximize and really utilize all their skills? Because one of the misconceptions is that somebody who is undocumented, someone who is a DACA holder, a TPS holder, someone who is fighting, who's an asylum seeker, the sentiment is that they're going to be in that status forever. And that's not true. We know that eventually they will hopefully get in a pathway and become U.S. citizens and contributing members of our society. If that's going to be the case, why not allow for them to use this time while they're waiting for their immigration status to clear? Why not utilize this time in the most effective way possible? And we realize that a lot of them want to get into barber school. A lot of them want to get into, be able to open up their own construction business. A lot of them want to do a whole host of things. So if that's the case, we said, let's remove the restrictions on getting the license. Now, they won't be able to work yet, and that's fine, because the moment they become legal permanent residents or get some type of lawful status or ability to work, they've already utilized all this time to be prepared. They have the license in hand. Now they're allowed to lawfully work, and they can fully incorporate. It was just making sure, and that was really the selling point, and making sure that this became a bipartisan agreement, because we realized, well, that's right. They are going to eventually be fully incorporated and be able to lawfully work. Why not utilize this time effectively? And fortunately, we were able to get a lot of our colleagues on board and pass this bill.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. You know, I saw the bill, and it was very interesting to see the breadth of it, because I know with licensing, probably all of us on this panel have seen that it can be very fragmented and very territorial. So I was glad to hear from Representative Ray that the police department was very supportive of opening the doors. Representative Ray, I wonder if what you found was an effective approach. We heard from others in this summit about educating, about telling stories of actual folks, and I wonder if you use that technique of getting to know some people who came here with an SIV, with a special immigrant visa, and we're able to have them help you in move this kind of legislation along.
It was interesting because we were actually approached by the chiefs of police to work on this. It was kind of something that they were very much behind. And then as we move forward, we've been pretty progressive when it comes to immigration and refugees here in Utah. We do our best. We have a refugee center where we try to help a lot of the people that come over as refugees end up starting their own businesses here in Utah. That's key for us. Very, very hard workers, very smart people that come across, and I think some areas they're marginalized, and what we try to do is capitalize on their talents and their skills. And so we really push hard to help refugees and immigrants when they come in to start their own businesses and to be able to be self-sufficient. And the one story that I told is a few years ago, I was invited over to the home of a refugee family that came in from Darfur. And the father was an oil executive, and when things turned against the U.S., he was run out because he worked for a U.S. company. They spent 7 years in a refugee camp, separated, half the family in one and half in the other, not even knowing what was happening with the other half. And luckily, our people here in Utah were able to be able to snag both halves of the family and bring them over together when they came. And so I'm sitting in this meager home that they have, and the son. And his name, interestingly, was Muhammad Ali. And when I talked about him, he didn't really, catch the Muhammad Ali, what I met here in the United States, but he had just started his first day on the job at one of our supermarkets here. And he showed up at work. He walked about 2 miles to work, showed up 2 hours early to make sure he was on time for his first day at work. And then I brought him onto the floor of the House a few weeks later and let him sit in on a day of the session. And he kind of sold this, the legislators that were there at the time. He just kept blurting out, I love this country, because we could argue. He didn't have to agree with the government. We were pushing back. And he said, in our country, you would be killed or imprisoned for what you guys are doing. And he just thought it was wonderful that citizens could come up and have an impact on government. And I think that was a selling point moving forward. Fast forward a couple of years later, we're working on this, and a lot of the body remembered when I brought him up, and so it was kind of a good segue into what we were doing. And like I say, very, very little, hardly any pushback at all from the body on doing this. Everybody was excited, just because of what our Department of Workforce Services had been doing at the refugee community here, and the kind of the good reputation behind being able to start up businesses and being very vital parts of our community.
Thank you. I wonder if the other panelists would like to comment on that. The power of the voices from the community, right? The idea that we are all so similar. We all want to work and contribute, and the idea that it's like Representative Flores said, it's all Nevadans, right? Not just some. We're all part of this. How do you bring in the voice of the refugee community and say, these are Georgians, or in my case, Georgians too? And how does that work for you in your state? Delegate Tran?
I think it's so important to hear directly from the community, whether it's on this particular issue around how do we help refugees integrate, or other issues, right? It's just so important to hear from people who are affected. And just really quickly, I had 2 bills. In 2020, I passed a bill to make it easier for newly resettled refugees in Virginia to access in-state tuition. So rather than waiting to be, to get the domicile status or residency status in Virginia, that you could qualify immediately. And we had also a former refugee for whom this bill would have been incredibly helpful when he had first resettled, come and share his experiences as part of witness testimony. And I think that is the hard part is you have to be able and be willing to put yourself out there and share your personal story. And sometimes that's easy to do, and other times it's really traumatic and painful to have to relive the particular experience in life. And so, in my own family, my mom at one point said to me, "I'm done. I'm not telling my story over and over and over again." When she was sharing a lot of it, particularly when I was in college, and I felt like it was just having to relive that trauma. And I think you have to respect that. But it's really helpful when people are willing to and are able to do that. And I also, in 2019, had passed another study bill on how do we help internationally trained physicians be able to break barriers and become medical doctors in the U.S. And as part of that work group, we also had somebody who was internationally trained who turned out to be a refugee from Afghanistan and was an anesthesiologist there. And so he talked about his struggle here. And I remember watching the fellow work group members, and it was like this aha moment of like, wait, the system doesn't work quite the way we thought it did, right? And how can we have you sitting in front of us who has all these talents and this experience and not working to your full potential? And so I think that was also really important to share. So I think that is so key, whether it's on study groups or commissions or in hearings or, as the representative said, bringing people to the floor and sharing those stories is incredibly important.
Representative Flores, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Sure. I guess the only thing I would add is, and this is particularly a huge problem here in the state of Nevada, human trafficking is a huge, huge, huge issue, and namely because of the branding of some certain cities here in the state of Nevada where we sell this, whatever you want to call it, and it creates this disgusting playground at times. I mention that because I think when we have the conversation, there's a lack of understanding what a refugee is versus a migrant versus an immigrant versus an unlawful immigrant versus all, and we tend to put all of them in this one category. And I say that because it creates a problem when we're trying to find consensus. And sometimes I've found that it's easier, rather than using those key phrases, that we start through a very specific type of issue. And so, for example, when you have a conversation about human trafficking, almost immediately and instinctively, everybody puts down their barriers as to what they believe a proper immigration conversation is, what the proper immigration channels are, what I'm okay with, all those biases that are dictated by our own experiences, by our family, our friends, by our political parties. Almost instantaneously, that goes down, and everybody collectively disagrees. Human trafficking is a problem. Well, if we start there and we're all on the same page, as we gradually move towards that conversation, and we start meeting some of these victims and how they're lured here from other countries, how they're slowly taken away from their families, how they're consistently being put on these mental and physical chains, all of a sudden everybody's on the same page. We're all talking about the same thing. I mention that only because often I've realized that starting conversations in those type of very heavy-handed lenses from the victims tends to put folk in a more collaborative, I want to do something now about this issue, and it allows us to find common ground much faster. And no one can say that story better than the victim herself or himself. And so I found that it's important that we do that. And I've found the most unwilling individual to have any type of conversation that involves an individual that wasn't even born here, even if they are now citizens, where they're just that extreme on the conversation, where we start the conversation with a lot of these issues. I realize that they tend to immediately come to the middle and say, we got to do something about this. And then the other thing I would say is just we as electeds also have a responsibility, and I often want to remind folks that we bring in these individuals, that we create the platform for them. We already have the microphone and the light on us all the time, so that we utilize the space that's given to us by the very nature of what we do to bring folk to light when they're comfortable with that, and really uplift them as folk that are part of our campaigns, that are volunteers, that are neighbors, that we take the initiative in normalizing their experience and that they belong. Because often I feel that there's this either tokenization that occurs where we want to have this particular conversation, that's when you can come into the space, or when we're trying to highlight a certain type of bill or issue. I found that, our undocumented community members, specifically when we talk about, when we talk about refugees, or when we talk about even just DACA or TPS holders, when they come into the space to talk about healthcare issues, when they come into the space to talk about environmental issues, when they come into the space to talk about small businesses, so that we detach this notion that this community member in Nevada only cares about this particular issue. We expand it and really just bring them into all the spaces that we have, and really that we create that platform for them.
Thank you. And I agree. It's interesting to hear the different perspectives of all of you on that. One of the things in Georgia is, we have the voices of our community. We've surveyed the community. We've asked, what do folks want? What are the barriers? We're in that constant conversation. But what's also really interesting to me is we're also in constant conversation with the business community. And, to bring both those voices to the table, is relatively new here. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about, the business community and how they've participated in expanding economic opportunities for new Americans, and how they view this as a positive for business in the state. Representative Ray.
Sure. I think our business community here in Utah has been very open to the refugee and the immigration population. Like I say, a lot of the new businesses started are by refugees, actually. And I've noticed our businesses will help mentor them. We have our community colleges, University of Utah, Weber State University, and some of the bigger universities also have programs that can help out. So, and as a legislature, through workforce services, we've tried to make sure that the funds are available for workforce training and different things, because the same thing, once they hit that citizenship, we want them to be able to be on their feet and moving forward with their lives and not have to start at that point to try to get ready to be successful. We realize that the more successful that we can make the refugee and the immigrant community, the more successful our state's going to be. It's a partnership, and we're not saying come here and live under us. We're saying come here and live with us and be a part of our community. And it's been great. We've had, the governors that we've had here in Utah for the past few governors have been open to it. And as a legislature, it's been a bipartisan issue all the way on that. So, we haven't got caught up in some of the, the issues that we see in other states where they, try to blame crime rates and other things. And we know that doesn't happen, especially if you're engaged and provide training. And, we know that for the fact, if you want to reduce crime rates, it's employment, get people jobs, make them a part of the community. And so we've taken that, for quite a long time. That's kind of been our philosophy here.
Delegate Tran, do you have something you'd like to share about the business community?
I think probably Virginia, I would say probably in our local communities, there are stronger ties to where we have larger communities of refugees or immigrants. I think there are stronger ties to the business community in terms of understanding the workforce needs and making that connection. Some of our chambers, I think, are more open to figuring out policies that are, I think, the intersection of immigration and workforce a little bit more and how that flows out. So, and what comes to mind is, for example, driver privilege cards for our undocumented Virginians, and making sure and understanding how that policy issue intersects with work and workforce and a healthy and welcoming community, and what that means, right, for the business community. And so I think depending on the chamber, I think there's a more openness to engage on some of these issues. I think what I see, quite frankly, sometimes in Richmond is, but an overall, I think we still have some bridging to do around the connections and strengthening those conversations with our business community.
And Representative Flores?
So what I would add, well, first, if you drive in my district now around any given weekend, you'll see a whole host of different communities who will set up shop in vacant spots and sell everything from services of repairing a vacuum all the way to some fresh made tacos, right? And that's very common. I've always argued that the entrepreneur spirit is very normal to most of our folk who come from other countries. The very fact that either they were pushed out of a different country or that they came here for whatever reason, and that they were willing to do all that, shows that fighter spirit, that very much necessary dogged, I'm going to do this attitude that it takes to make a business work. I've had an opportunity for a lot of years to work with the Land Chamber of Commerce here locally. And in fact, as a kid, I worked there. And I would see that very story of the individual who comes in with $5,000 in their piggy bank and says, I'm going to make this work. And I was always very appreciative of our chambers here in the state of Nevada because they understood the importance of doing that 101. I think the energy, the spirit, the fighter that it takes, the grit is there in our communities. But one of the things that was often lacking was just that business 101. And bridging the two has been instrumental and pivotal because today, specifically in Southern Nevada, you'll see folk who have branched off, who started off this big, and now they have 3 or 4 multiple locations, and it's been an honor to see them operating. If I could just recognize one of our Assemblywoman Selena Torres here in the state of Nevada, her along with the Nevada Immigrant Coalition and Mi Familia Vota and a few others, and our Lieutenant Governor, they created a task force to have this very specific conversation on how do we help link, right? How do we become that bridge between community members who have the willingness with the right resources and connecting that puzzle. And the only other thing that I would add to all this that I think is very important is as we're navigating through figuring out what we want to do in terms of helping that innovative mind get to something real, whether it's a restaurant or whatever it is. One of the things that I've seen that has been very successful here in Nevada unintentionally is we have a lot of things like the swap meets, right? And I think the swap meets is always like the 101 to getting a business going. But one of the things that I've liked that the chambers have done and that the state has gotten involved with is that's where all that entrepreneur spirit is at in one location, really coming into that space proactively and seeing these different communities, whether it be our amazing Ethiopian community or our Central American, whatever it may be, that are making their way into Nevada. One of the beautiful things is helping them expand out of that. And some of them refuse today, till this day, and they've had it for 20 years, refuse to close their little shop at the swap meet because they feel that was the gateway for them to expand to now what they have, their 4 or 5 restaurants or their 4 or 5 tire shops, their 4 or 5 whatever it may be. So I just, I encourage every state to really utilize that as a hub. You come in there and you extract those folk that are ready to take that next leap and really to walk them through that 101. And then the other thing I'll just say is making sure that we're doing this in other languages other than English. Mm-hmm. That 101 needs to be, 101 business class has to be in other languages outside of English.
I just want to second that a little bit. We recently started an Asian American and Pacific Islander caucus in Virginia. And one of the things we've been hearing is the critical need to make sure that information is being shared in other languages, how to start a small business, what are all the requirements if you wanted to apply for to be a state contractor, what does it mean? So there's that piece, even the bookkeeping practices and such if you were going to apply for grants or loans from the state, right? And the relief under COVID. And so that you might be able to qualify, but are you going to submit a successful application? And then if you do, are you going to be able to fully document afterwards, right? To be able to get, as that process plays out. And so how do we make that information readily accessible in other languages? And how do we push it out? I think that's the other piece that we are starting to really think about and hearing from the community on is not so much as waiting, at our small business development center for people to come in and ask for help, but recognizing the relationship between government and assistance, right, with some of our refugee and immigrant communities is a little bit of a different relationship. And if that trust wasn't there in your home country, it might not be carried over when you are here. So how do you make sure that we are actively, reaching into communities and bring this information directly to people?
Well, thank you. I think we have run out of time. I started out by saying that there were going to be a lot of great ideas to steal, and I have a notepad full of them. So I want to thank you all for I'm going to rattle off some for people who may be thinking about what to do in their state. Take a look at licensing. See what's not working and what doesn't make sense, like for police officers having to be citizens. Or take a look more broadly at immigration restrictions at licensing. Take a look at in-state tuition. Take a look at organizing websites and one-stop shops for new business entrepreneurs that are offered in languages, and reach out to your communities. Reach out to the refugee community, reach out to the business community, and be that bridge. Those are a few of the ideas that I'm taking away from today, and I'm just very grateful for you all. Thank you very much for sharing your excellent work. And I think we will turn it over now to hear a little bit more about the business pledge and how businesses are getting engaged in this work as well.